Welcome to the Saugus Historical Society's first meeting of the fall. As we have been aware all day, it's September 11th, and we certainly know one of the things that date is significant for. But today I'll talk about one more thing that date is important for, and that's the Battle of the Brandywine during the Revolutionary War. On that date, the colonial army won a significant victory, and pertinent to today's subject, it cemented Lafayette's usefulness as a soldier in the mind of George Washington and many of the other comrades that he had fighting with him on that day. So it's part of the reason, if we're trying to mark a turning point from his being, well, here's a wealthy French person that is coming to help us, that's great, now let's see if he knows anything. They realized that he would be very useful to them in many, many ways. And it's part of the reason why so many people, even today, over 200 years later, are remembering him and knowing that he was a hero to the United States. And he's often called the hero of two worlds, Europe and North America. So let me go and start looking at it a little bit. One thing that you may have noticed, and I've been increasingly aware of it, is how many things, places, cities and towns, for example, but also parks, plazas, streets, are named for Lafayette. It's kind of funny to think named for him because none of them use his actual name. His actual name was a mouthful. It was Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Motier. So you can understand why your town was not named that. But his title, the Marquis de Lafayette, is what he was most often known by, as kind of a shortened version of that whole thing. And so there are towns called Lafayette in several states. Many towns and cities, including at least Marblehead and Salem, close to us, have streets named Lafayette. And often they're because he actually walked through them at some point, often during this 1824 to 25 tour that I'm going to be talking most about today. But going back to his childhood a bit, because many people wonder why he decided to come away from his native country and fight for the United States. It meant, for at least a little while, renouncing his French citizenship. It's the usual thing if a person goes and fights for another country that their home country says not a citizen anymore. Sometimes it gets switched back. And that is what happened in his case later, when they said, okay, this turned out all right. They're allies of ours now. They weren't at the time. But this gives a few reasons why he thought freedom was extremely important. Some people have pointed out that all the education at that time was emphasizing ancient Rome and Greece and the republics. And so they should have guessed that this would instill in the young men's minds, because it was mostly young men learning this, that monarchies were not good. And so it's not too surprising that many of them had ideas that we should be rebelling and it should be a republic, and that's what we want to make our country become. In the case of Lafayette, his father died in battle in 1759. Lafayette was born in 1747, so he's very young, still a child really, when his father is lost, and he's raised by his mother and grandmother. So it may have been a bit of a feeling of he wanted to win some glory in battle that made him want to become a soldier, but it was also the expectation for people lower nobility like his family, that didn't have an awful lot of money or grand estates. What else would you do? So by the time he was 14 years old, he was a commissioned officer in the Musketeers in the French army. 14. And by 19, his career didn't seem to be going as quickly as he hoped, so he resigned from the French army, but was able to afford a ship. He bought a ship and sailed it to the American colonies and offered to, found out who he should go and talk to, and offered himself and his services, as well as a few men who came with him to George Washington's army without pay. So they weren't risking very much by taking him on. A lot of this information comes from the Lafayette College website. So one of the things, besides cities, towns, streets, parks, etc., there's 2 colleges in the country. One of them is in Easton, Pennsylvania, and they were established in 1826, just a couple of years after his tour. So it was probably just another bit of the charisma that he had kind of extending into, well, we met him, so let's name our college after him. And it's been very active ever since, promoting his remembrance of him and his deeds, and anniversaries like this year on significant events in his life. Lafayette College, their website even, as it talks a bit about their history, quotes a letter that he wrote to his wife, Adrienne, who he married when she was 12, I think, and he was 14. Now, this was their parents' idea, that they get married at that age. But he wrote to her to explain why he was coming and leaving for a significant amount of time. The welfare of America is intimately connected with the happiness of all mankind. She will become the respectable and safe asylum of virtue, integrity, tolerance, equality, and a peaceful liberty. Still a work in progress. But, that does really sound like the goals and eloquent letter that he wrote. So this is the statue of him that stands outside of that Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. There are many, many statues of him, too, in addition to all the other things that I mentioned. When he first came over here, artists were vying to paint him because he was at least a curiosity, a good-looking young man in a fancy uniform, and clearly able to win the respect of George Washington, who was noted for being somewhat reserved, but not so much where Lafayette was concerned. In 1777, Washington commissioned him a major general. It wasn't that unusual for young men of 19 and 20 to become generals, but most of them were older. And he had the advantage of a few years of experience in the French army, which must have seemed like a good feature since we were fighting Great Britain, that a European soldier experience had to have been useful. In September of 1777, the Battle of Brandywine, so this was September 11th, he was wounded in the leg, and once he recovered, Washington thought about what he had accomplished. While wounded, he organized a very good retreat that lost very little for the colonial army. I mean, the retreat was necessary, and Washington was impressed with his skills. So he gave him command of a division, and Lafayette spent the grueling winter of at Valley Forge with George Washington and the troops, which, as we all know from the history books, was a great struggle for everybody involved. Not enough provisions, cold temperatures, very difficult situation. So he fought a few battles, and then in 1779 he returned to France to see his wife and to recruit more troops to the U.S. cause, and returned with them in I think within several months, like 1780, he came back and fought a few more battles. Then, once the war was won, he brought some significant ships to Yorktown. So the final battle partly was turned. It looked like the colonial troops would lose, and they won partly because of the French fleet coming to support them. And this was recruited by Lafayette. Now, he wasn't the only European general that we had working with us. What?
You had Germans, too.
Yes, we had Germans. Von Steuben, I think, was one. We had I don't know if Pulaski was a general, it might have been a couple of Polish, Pulaski and Kosciuszko. Now Pulaski was actually killed in battle before the end. Kosciuszko lived through it, retired, and like a lot of American-born soldiers, had to fight to get his back pay at the end of it, and finally did get it. Pulaski was called the father of American cavalry, and Kosciuszko returned to Europe after he finally got his pay and lived until 1817. Baron von Steuben lived on a farm in New York where he seemed to be a lavish spender, but he enjoyed living on a farm until he died in 1794. So they were all a little bit older, and Lafayette outlived them. But when he went back to France, he found the country very divided, and I remember from when I was about in the 4th grade and first learned the French national anthem and was horrified at how gruesome the national anthem was, that you sing on regular occasions. So with all the blood running in the furrows, just to take a line from the song, Lafayette was at risk many times because he had a title, even if it wasn't a very high one and he wasn't wealthy. He believed that there should be liberty, but he didn't really want a republic form of government. He thought the monarchy should be preserved, just kind of like the United Kingdom is now, with limited powers, but sort of a status that kind of reminded people of the continuity of the country, and yet the people had lots of freedoms. And this didn't really sit well with either extreme. So as the monarchy was toppled and so many people beheaded, and then Napoleon and his people were extreme, and they didn't think Lafayette was good because he was nobility, but they did have to respect him to some extent because there were so many people who supported him. At one point, as I mentioned earlier, he was in prison for 5 years at Olmütz in Austria. Initially, it was solitary confinement, and his wife found out about this, and she and her daughters came and persuaded Napoleon to allow them to stay in the prison with him, so at least he wouldn't be solitary. And then from the prison and also from outside, because she was able to come and go with a little bit more freedom, but still was in this underground cell, basically. Many other European nations were persuaded that, oh, they're now imprisoning innocent women and children in underground cells. And this doesn't seem very civilized. So the public opinion of the other countries seemed to turn against them, and they eventually were let out. Napoleon allowed him out, allowed him to come back to France. Where he really wanted to go was North America, but they were not going to give him leave to go there. Eventually, he thought he was going to be coming back and forth, often visiting Washington, but time passed, lots of things happened, and it wasn't until the 50th anniversary of the end of the Revolutionary War that he was able to make a return. By that time, his wife had passed away. His only son, whose name was Georges, with the French way, with an S, Washington de Motier was his full name, came with him, and a secretary, Levasseur, when he was invited by President Monroe to come back for some ceremonies marking the 50th anniversary in Washington, D.C. So when he first came, he was a very young man with, although a powdered wig, which might make him seem to be older, but that was the style. Everybody had them. This is a sketch of the first meeting of Washington and Lafayette at the beginning of the war, and a painting of Valley Forge. This version is in the Marblehead Museum. And they have on the wall a framed letter that he wrote in 1791, I think it is, to George Washington. Here's a sketch of what he looked like at that point. Oh, 1784, I'm sorry. He wrote it to the town of Marblehead, appreciating the nice dinner that they gave him when he came through the town on a recent visit. This is a picture. It's very hard to read, and written out a little bit more, it's very grateful. This is part of the reason probably that all people seemed to love him so much, was that he wrote thank you letters to just about everyone that he met. He would shake hands with anyone who came up to him and seemed the least bit friendly. He had a lot of charisma, apparently. So he was a famous personage who wasn't afraid to mingle with blacksmiths and farmers and everyone else, regardless of their status. He had interesting views from many people's point of view. Now, he was a friend of George Washington, but he had extremely strong views that slavery could not possibly be part of what the United States was going to be about. So he managed to do this in a friendly enough way that Washington, Jefferson, all of the people who had slaves didn't write him off and say, I'm not talking to you anymore. But he made it known at many, many meetings that I think we need to educate people, free them, make everybody equal. This is the only way that we can really live up to what is being promised, and this is what the world should offer. And that was what he said in France as well, but obviously the kings didn't agree with that, and in some sense the Republican rebels didn't really agree with it, because they said, yeah, everybody is equal except the monarchs whose heads we will cut off. So when he came back in this is before we get to that, you notice him holding up a small object. He's standing in the middle with a little, looks like a target in that black and white picture, and I've got something rather similar on here right now. Because our colors are the same, it could be an American patriotic pin or a French one, hard to tell. But he's the one that came up with the 3 colors for the cause of liberty in France. The traditional militia colors of Paris were red and deep blue. And he added, or the city colors, I should say. And the militia traditionally used white, so he added that to the other 2 and said, this is the symbol we should have. And he's remembered both, depending on which side you were on again, for that both with reverence and with disgust, because the kings didn't like that. So they said, you support Lafayette? Well, he's the one that came up with that miserable tricolor combination. By 1824, the powdered wigs were no longer in style. He was no longer all that young. He was 66 when he first arrived, nearly 67 when he came over on the ship. His natural hair color was dark brown, and this is pretty much what he looked like when he first arrived this time. So hard to recognize him from the original young man that had left at the end of the Revolutionary War. But people remembered him, and part of the reason that they did was because of the letters that he had written to not only George Washington, but to many, many of the people who later became presidents, congressmen, etc. And they all considered him their friend. They followed his ups and downs in France and that long period of imprisonment with great concern. And this country had become a nation, had changed quite a bit, was not exactly the same shape, but almost the same size that it is now. And this is a picture from the New England Historical Society that shows the, in different colors, the areas in the US that had become states. So those are in light pink. In 1824, guess how many there were? 24. So same number as the year. And the other areas in brown and purple are disputed areas. There's just a few. There's the top part of Maine that you can see right up there, and a little bit of Michigan. The brown areas are disorganized territories that are not yet states, that don't really have a ruling set of government. And so there were quite a few states, though, by this point. New England had all its states. Only recently, because it wasn't until 1820 that Maine separated from Massachusetts. It had been eastern Massachusetts up to that point. What else was going on, though? James Monroe was president for a little while longer, but there was an election coming up. And in November of 1824, there were 4 people competing. John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams, who had been president, and he had met Lafayette as a young man in the 1780s and had fought with him. Fought with him in the army. William Crawford of Georgia, who Lafayette knew because he had come to France during the Bourbon Restoration period, and they had met and become somewhat friendly. Henry Clay from Kentucky, who I don't think he had met before, but had certainly heard of, and Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. All 4 of these were very hotly contesting each other to become president. It was one of the most hyper-partisan elections in history. We wouldn't know anything about that. So one thing, though, interestingly enough, they all agreed on, that they were excited to see Lafayette return. And all of them wanted to be seen with him as much as possible. Everybody did, really. It took until February 9th, after Henry Clay's delegates decided that they weren't going to probably quite make it, and they decided to support Adams, that John Quincy Adams was declared the winner. Congress actually had to make the decision because there was so little, there weren't enough delegates to easily put it together, and so Congress voted. Now, Lafayette had only planned to be here 4 months, so he was coming in July and thought that he would leave before winter set in. But fairly early in his visit, he wanted to come to see where the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought, because he hadn't been at that one, but it was one of the first important ones in the history, so he wanted to see the site. And while he was there, they mentioned that they were going to be laying the cornerstone to the Bunker Hill Monument in about a year from that point, and they'd be honored if he would lay the cornerstone. And he said, well, I don't think I'm going to be here that long. But the more he thought about it, the more he thought, well, I could be. There's no reason I have to go back now. Maybe I could just stay here. Maybe everybody's going to give me dinner and I won't have to spend a penny on my entire visit. And that's pretty much what happened. So he knew he had a goal that he was going to stay till the following summer. So what was he going to do to fill the time in between? He spent the winter, or most of it, in Washington, D.C. He spent a little time. By this point, the city had been rebuilt after the War of 1812 when it had been burned. So the capital was back again in Washington, and President and Congress was there. So there were all these disputes going on that must have fascinated him to some extent while they were determining who was actually going to be president after the election wasn't decisive enough. In some ways, his tour must have been a bit bittersweet because George Washington had died. Many of his friends had died. One of the first people that he came to visit was John Adams, the father. He visited him at Peacefields in Quincy, which is a National Historic Site that you can visit now. And he was quite elderly and had to be fed by family members. He couldn't lift a spoon. But he could talk and remember things, and Lafayette said his mind was as strong as ever, even if he was somewhat frail. When he first visited Marblehead in 1783, his good friends Eldridge Gerry and General John Glover were still living, but they were both gone by 1824. He was, in fact, the last surviving Revolutionary War general by this point, by 50 years later. So that was part of the reason for his invitation. But it was amazing how much joy and affection he was greeted with everywhere he went. It also kind of amazes me, as the itinerary of this tour has been published. Levasseur, his secretary who came with him, kept very good records. He kept a journal in which he recorded the places where they were received for specific events. He didn't note every single town they passed through, so he missed at least one that's kind of important. It's almost certain that then, as well as in 1780 when he accompanied Washington to visit the New England states, that he came up what's now Lincoln Avenue through Saugus. And Saugus was a separate town from Lynn, had been since 1814, or 15 is when it was incorporated. So, you know, there would have been that, but there wasn't a special reception. He was received a couple of places in Lynn, both on the Common and at what's now known as the Goldfish Pond, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So many of the people who stood on the sidelines of his route were elderly veterans who had actually fought with him. Others were children who had heard the stories. Others were ladies who were carrying on the memory and preserving history in various ways, who had certainly heard of him and thought he was very important and significant and worthy of being discussed. Now you can follow some of his path because there are metal markers called the Lafayette Trail in a lot of the towns he stopped in. They're not always easy to find, but the paper that I gave you gives you the website where you can go and see where they are. So I went to several of them that were close by. Paul would come home from work and say, "Were you Lafayetting today?" Because in the honored new way, we're making all nouns into verbs. So I was Lafayetting quite a bit during the last month or so. This is, I think this is August 28th, 1824. That is Reading. He was in Reading, having dinner with somebody. And then he returned to Boston, because that wasn't terribly far away. But on some of these trips, it was amazing. Like on August 31st, he went from Chelsea, where there were ceremonies, through Revere and Saugus and Lynn. He stopped at two places and had to hear speeches about how wonderful he was. And then he went to Marblehead and had more speeches and a dinner. And then he went to Salem and had maybe 2 dinners and more speeches. Now, he wasn't on foot. He was in a carriage. So this is in Lynn. The marker is a place that's a little bit difficult to find, although at least it's not hidden by trees. It is right on a little triangle of land near the south end of the Common, right across from the traffic circle by Market Basket. So that's the circle at Market Basket that you can see in that picture. And here's the map on the bus stop. It's right next to a bus stop. So you can see kind of why they put the marker in that exact spot, because he walked along quite a few places. But if you go to Lynn Common, you can fairly easily find it if you find the little bus stop beside there. The other site in Lynn is not as well known to us anymore, but it's near the town line with Swampscott, and as he moved and was heading towards Swampscott, there's a little park that has been often known as Lafayette Park. The street name says Lafayette Park. If you look up there, right at about the top of the picture, you can see that that's what the sign says. But everywhere in the little park itself that this street goes halfway around, it seems to be known as the Goldfish Pond. So if you ask people where Lafayette Park is, they'd have to be close neighbors to know the street. And if you ask them where the Goldfish Pond is, though most people would know. So there's a little pond in the middle of the park, and there's an association that they follow the history of it. Why did they take Lafayette to this place, and why was there a park there? Because goldfish weren't really being celebrated that much in those days. But it was very near where the first settler in Lynn lived. The Ingalls family built a log cabin there, and their descendants still lived in that area. So one of the more significant places besides the common would have been this site. So they said, let's take him up the scenic route, near the ocean, near some of these historic sites. And so this is what it looks like today with the dancing windsock figures in the middle. They're trying to scare away the geese, but you notice they're not scaring them very much at all. And there's ducks and there's sometimes herons in that pond. It's a lovely, very peaceful little spot. They went through Swampscott, proceeded up to Marblehead, and he had been through Marblehead before with George Washington more than 50 years before that. So there were people there that he knew or that had maybe been children and remembered him from that point. And he stopped and was entertained at the Hooper Lee Mansion. There is a marker right there, but it's kind of hidden behind a tree. So even when I had the address to it, it took me a little while to figure out where on earth they had put it. Yeah, just inside the gate. So you're driving by, you'd never see it. A person on foot might be able to find it. And the marker says he was addressed by John Prince on behalf of the town. Well, I found John Prince's house, and John Prince was a selectman, but also a blacksmith in the town of Lynn for quite a while. And he wasn't the only significant person to live in his house. There's also on the house a marker for Cato Prince, who was John Prince's enslaved man up until 1780, when he freed him so he could fight in the Revolutionary War. So Cato Prince was a soldier at that time. So Lafayette met as many people as he could. Many people came out from far away. If he wasn't marching through their town, he was going to be marching nearby, and people would come from a distance to stand along the sidelines and meet him. Now you might recognize this location and wonder how they had such good photography back in those days, but this was only Labor Day. This was September 3rd, 2024. So for the 200th anniversary, there were many people with time-appropriate clothing who came out to represent those greeting Lafayette, and a reenactor who looked an awful lot like him, I would have to say. So you can see some of the soldiers out there with the statue. This is Mr. Finney, who was giving the welcoming address, and they preceded in some of the older soldiers and surviving members of the Revolutionary Militia through an arch of evergreens and flowers, kind of honorary arch on the common, because Lafayette wanted to see the battle green where all this started. Fife and drum corps. So appropriate music. There were about 200 people this Labor Day out on the battle green in Lexington, watching, and a few of them being participants in the event. So here we see the Revolutionary War Monument, and if you look closely over the heads of all the people between me and the event, you can see Lafayette in the top hat shaking hands with Mr. Finney. Phineas, I think. Finney is the last name. And being presented with some certificates and gifts by people of the town. Here he is giving a short speech himself. It must have been pretty exhausting, because even though the horse did a lot of the legwork toting the carriage, they were parading for hours and hours all of these days, going to various towns so that he could see as many people as possible, because he got so many invitations and didn't want to turn any down. So here's the notable folks of the town as they were represented this past Labor Day. Here he is being given a musket that was inscribed because it had been given by Washington to the grandfather, I think, of the young man who was now giving it to Lafayette as the most appropriate gift he could come up with. A few of these people might even look familiar to you, the ones that are in modern day clothes. So on the left right there is the Historical Society Vice President. Our friend Mark Millman is wearing the little sunflower pin made by a Ukrainian crocheter. The little child in the 1824, what was known as a skeleton suit, that one-piece suit, is the son of my friend Julia, who's holding the baby, and her mother, Barbara. Those are all what ladies would have appropriately worn in 1824 if they came out to an event like this. You have to look really hard because it's behind some evergreens at the foot of the hill to the belfry in downtown Lexington to find the marker for this one. And this says on September 2nd, 1824, he was received on the Common and brought to the monument where there was much speechification. And he went to several other towns on that day, actually, in the original 1824 tour. And then he proceeded west. So here's the marker in Reading, a little bit out of order, but there's a picture of what it looked like. And then as he went up, this is 1825. There were two periods when he visited New England states. So Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island a few times. During the war, there wasn't fighting here, but he did go right about the end of the war when Washington became president. He came to southern New England, not up to Maine. New Hampshire, though, I think he went to Portsmouth on that trip. So that was 1780-something, 81. Then on this trip, he spent the winter in the southern states, came back in spring of 1825, and went up to quickly visit Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont so that he could say that he'd been to all 24 states. So here's some of the signs. This is the Common in Newport, New Hampshire, which is up near Lake Sunapee. This is Kennebunk, Maine, a much older sign. And when I spent more time in Maine, I do remember this tree that is the seal on the town of Kennebunk. That elm tree right there was standing when Lafayette came to visit Kennebunk the first time. Now, sometime in 1970, might have been 72 or 73, it finally wasn't alive enough to survive and it was taken down. But it did last many, many decades. So here's a photograph of the Lafayette elm when it was still standing. Oh. Okay. I don't think this was the last slide, but it says it is. The timeline of the visit is on one of those websites that I mentioned. And so in 1824, he was invited. He left France on July 13th. I'm not going to tell you where he was every day. Most significant are the trips to New England, which was late summer and early fall in 1824. And then in 1825, he came up here several times. He was down visiting Jefferson and Monroe and a few other people that he knew for a good deal of the trip. He also made a trip to the south and west. He first went down the Atlantic coast through the Carolinas, never made it to Florida, it wasn't a state yet, but as far as Georgia, then west to Alabama, stayed several days in New Orleans. I guess he liked it out there, thought it was festive. Went up to Indiana, went up the Hudson River. On May 8th, about midnight, the steamship they were on, the Hudson River, started to sink. And so that was an unwelcome adventure on an otherwise very pleasant trip where everybody was arranging things for his benefit and enjoyment, but still a hectic schedule. He didn't seem to mind that too much. But the ship started to sink, and he and his entourage, which included his son and his secretary, were scrambling to get the gifts and artifacts as well as himself off onto one of the lifeboats, and also to get all the other people off. They managed to get everyone off, but there were some very tense moments where he thought his son was nowhere to be found, and he was busy still trying to herd people onto the lifeboats. And it was dark. They sat on the bank of the river all wet from having been in the water with a campfire, waiting to see if they would be rescued in the daylight, if they could find somebody that would take them. At this point, they figured out that no one drowned, no one was down with the ship, but they didn't have a way of getting to their destination, Louisville, Kentucky, and then back on their schedule so that they could be ready for laying the cornerstone. They had a deadline now. It didn't seem like they were going to have any trouble at first, and then all of a sudden it started seeming like, we might not make it by the anniversary. But they did. By the 17th, they had made it back there. And then they decided to go up. They went to Portland, Maine on June 24th. By the 28th, they were going across the Cornish Bridge from New Hampshire into Vermont. They went all the way up to Burlington, Vermont in just a couple of days. And then they went down to West Point by July 2nd. Made a return visit to Mount Vernon and celebrated his birthday, which was September 6th, at the White House with the finally decided upon president, who was John Quincy Adams. So, they said, please eat dinner at the White House, you'll be leaving in a couple of days. And then he took a ship back to France. Went back to serving in the military over there. I forgot to mention another significant date. He was in New York City on the 4th of July in 1825, and he was greeting many crowds, and he was on the banks of the Hudson River. There were a group of children, and there was a little 5-year-old boy who he picked up and kissed on the cheek. And the reason we know this is that little boy remembered it. You don't remember an awful lot of things from when you're 5, but many people do have one memory of something that was really so astounding. So this young boy grew up to become a writer that we all have heard of. That was Walt Whitman. And he wrote, I remember I was taken up by Lafayette in his arms and held a moment. I remember that he pressed my cheek with a kiss as he sat me down. The childish wonder and nonchalance during the whole affair at the time, contrasting with the indescribable preciousness of the reminiscence since. Medford has a marker, Ipswich has a marker, Marbleheads and Linz I've already mentioned. When he reached Salem on that trip at the end of August, 300 Federalist gentlemen wined and dined him at Hamilton Hall, which is still standing on Chestnut Street. And then the same day, he visited the Republicans at the Assembly House on Federal Street. Odd that the Federalists didn't meet on Federal Street, but that's the way it was. And the Assembly House is owned by the Peabody Essex Museum. So both of the buildings were significant in other ways to the city's history, and he stayed there. Another place that was significant was Sturbridge. There's some markers out there that he went and visited. Even Joseph Bonaparte, who was Napoleon's younger brother and who had settled in New York, I think it was, in this country. He even went and visited him. He owned, New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey. He owned a farm there. And even though Napoleon had been mostly not a friend of Lafayette, but occasionally, if it seemed politically important to do so, did a few things, like he did finally decide to get him freed from that prison in Olmutz. So Fayetteville, North Carolina was probably the first city to name itself after him, and that was before this visit. It was 1783. So Fayetteville, not necessarily Lafayette, but Fayetteville was also the name of a lot of streets and towns and cities in many of the southern and central states named after him. Basically, if he came to your city, you would immediately change the name of the town. Or if he walked up your street, you'd do the same thing. So Lafayette Square across from the White House, for example, that's where the National Christmas tree is set up. And there's a statue of him there. And it's called Lafayette Square because they wanted to honor him with a location and a statue. In Alabama, he kind of shocked a lot of people by publicly shaking the hands of each man from a black regiment of soldiers who had fought in the War of 1812. That was not a thing that you normally did in the South in those days. But some of his entourage said, "Oh, you don't want to do that." And he says, "Oh, yeah, I do." And he did. They were welcomed by St. Louis by Governor William Clark, who was Lewis and Clark, one of Lewis and Clark. So quite a few of the places. He visited Andrew Jackson's house. The William C. Pomeroy Foundation is the organization that has made most of these markers, those blue background ones that I showed you several of. And that's an organization that has two goals: promoting local history, so they make markers for towns that request them and that help them raise money to put a marker in the town. And they also donate to leukemia causes for finding cures for disease. They went to Niagara Falls, just a lot of places. I just wanted to kind of finish up a little bit by mentioning a few other sites, even ships named after him. Now, no place that I found is named Dumotier, which was his actual name, much less the full name, but Lafayette, Fayetteville, and LaGrange. You might not think that has anything to do with him. Grange is pretty much French for barn, but Lagrange was how it was pronounced in France, and it was the name of his property. So there were a couple of places in the South that he said, the rolling hills here remind me of my home in France. It makes me, remember what it looks like there. And so they promptly renamed the town LaGrange. Well, Lagrange, but pronounced it LaGrange. The ship that he sailed back home on, his passage back to France, was donated. The ship had been called the Susquehanna, but since he was going to be riding on it, they changed the name, not to Lafayette in this case, but to Brandywine, to commemorate the battle fought on September 11th that he had participated in. Other things not especially known are that Independence Hall was kind of a rundown, sort of at risk of falling down place until it was heard that he was going to be visiting. And then they fixed it up and said, let's make this a proper historic monument. And they restored the old State House, named it Independence Hall, and you can't imagine Philadelphia without it now. He had a very emotional visit to Washington's tomb. And, it must have been a little bit of a letdown in some ways as he went back to France, where there were not as many people who revered him. Even though he's called the hero of two worlds, in France, people are sort of lukewarm. Some people do admire him, but there are other people who kind of feel like, well, he wasn't quite enough on our side, whichever side it was that he was on. In 1832, just a few years before he died, he attended a 4th of July banquet in Paris, attended by a lot of expatriate Americans, including Samuel F.B. Morse, who gave the toast. And this is where he gave him sort of the nickname, the hero whom two worlds claim as their own, which became the title of one of the somewhat recent books that I enjoyed very much. And he said, "Our guest is a tower among the waters. His foundation is upon a rock. He moves not with the ebb and flow of the stream. The storm may gather, the waters may rise and even dash above his head, or they may subside at his feet. Still, he stands unmoved." So I've probably run a little bit beyond what I had thought of, but we started somewhat late. Any questions or comments or things people might like to add?
That was wonderful.
Oh, okay. I hope some of you might want to do some Lafayette during this year and go see some of the markers or read a little bit about where he went and what he did. Yes?
Our grammar school was in Lafayette.
Oh, okay. It was called Lafayette School? And where? What town?
In Everett.
In Everett, okay. Oh, all right, yeah. Somewhere I recently saw, but I guess it didn't make it into my slides, an old picture of Route 1 in the 1960s. And that would not be a place that I would necessarily have expected to see the name Lafayette. But there, between all the signs for Zaire and Hilltop Steakhouse, there's Lafayette. And apparently there was a rug store named Lafayette Rugs, right, kind of in between that section between Linfells Parkway and Walnut Street on the southbound side. I don't remember it, but I guess I wasn't buying a lot of rugs. But, you know, almost every place. You go for a drive, Paul and I went out Route 20, and we drove by, and I'm noticing it a lot, the name Lafayette. Lafayette Park, a street going off on the side. So you probably will pick it up a little bit more than you would have necessarily noticed it.
Well, he seemed to have slept around.
Well, okay.
That
Indeed.
was not an inference. The laughing people, that was not made for that inference.
Yeah.
Around,
Yeah, well, that is, you know, I think that was sort of what people would expect of Frenchmen. I have not heard anything that any of the relationships were not consensual. If anything, everybody said, please, oh yeah, sure.
That wasn't where I was going.
Okay.
It's a hotel.
Oh, okay, sorry. But what I was saying was also true, that there were, you know, he was away from home for a long, long time. He did love his wife, but, you know, there were, sorry. But yeah, yes. And I suppose like Washington, maybe many people said Lafayette slept in this hotel or other, that he may or may not have. Certainly he dined at many places, because you figure on these long trips where he's spending 14 hours a day on the road going from town to town and having to listen to a speech and give one of his own at each and every one of them, you must get hungry and thirsty. And they would have to sleep a few hours a night somewhere. Yeah.
You mentioned the college in eastern Pennsylvania. How did that all happen? Any idea?
Well, it was incorporated and named in 1826. So I think the beginnings of it were during his tour. And it was all the rage to name things after Lafayette. Everybody was still extremely enthused about him. And so this college was one of the places. He visited many schools that were becoming incorporated, especially if they were teaching black children, because it was another opportunity for him to say how important it was that everybody to be free. He visited a few women's colleges, which were still a kind of odd, unusual thing to many people, and some Native American schools. He actually had 1 or 2 Native Americans who were wards. In other words, they weren't exactly adopted children, but he took them under his wing. They stayed with his family for a while. He paid for their educations. And I'm not sure anybody knows why he picked those particular people, whether they happened to be in the right place at the right time or what it was. But you know, he wanted to emphasize that everybody should be equal and that he was going to behave that way as much as possible. He did have one unfortunate situation. He bought 3 plantations in Florida. He never went there himself, but his goal was to emancipate all the slaves on that plantation. And he had about 3 plantations. He bought one, and then he said, I need more people because there's not enough people, because I need to establish some schools. We need to train them before we let them free, if they don't have any skills, that's not going to really help them that much. So he started having people teach them, and this is when he got imprisoned back in France. And unfortunately, the result was that he did own slaves for a period of time, even though his goal was very different than to have a plantation, but that he wasn't able to free them because he didn't have the money. His farm was taken away from him in France, and Napoleon said, well, I'll only give it back, and I'll only restore your citizenship and your family's citizenship if you sell us your plantations with the people on it. Nope, you can't exempt the people. People too. You have to have that. So, it was pretty much his survival, or he had to sell it back to them. So, sell it back to France that had owned it initially, because it was a French colony at the base of Florida. Even though most of Florida was Spanish, this was a French colony that he had purchased the plantation from. There's a monument to Lafayette on Boston Common. It's not a three-dimensional statue. It's a metal relief on a rectangular stone. There's a bust of him in the Athenaeum, which I only had pointed out last night. Paul and I went to a lecture of a book discussion about one of the other books on that list that I haven't read. And the author of that, Laura Oricchio, was an art historian who became fascinated by Lafayette. And so how she started, she went to Versailles to view this bust that she was writing about, and then she became fascinated with the subject and wound up writing a long and very footnoted book like this one is. Everything is referenced to information from the time period, original source. So it may be more information than you ever wanted to read, but if you have questions about specific aspects of his life, activities, my main interest was this visit, where he went, especially the places in New England, and why people all thought he was so important. Was it just the charisma? What was it? Because even though some people say, well, he was a glory seeker, that's why he joined the U.S. Army. It couldn't have really meant that much to him originally. He wasn't from here. He didn't know anyone here. And yet they say, but all the glory seekers, you usually find out they were really nasty people. And that's not the impression you generally get when you add together all the aspects. I mean, you can point out some flaws, but when you add things up together, he seemed like he was working in the right direction, speaking up for what he believed was right, and things that in most cases we still think that way, or think even more so that way than the general public did at the time. Okay, well, I do have a Marblehead newspaper out on the table out there. I have a Trails and Sales booklet if people want to see. I don't think there's any Lafayette activities specifically scheduled, but there's a lot of things going on in Essex County. I mentioned, I think I said, no I didn't, trailsandsales.org is a good place to see all the updates for events between the 14th and the 29th, all over, free events all over Essex County. So a few more historical activities. If you did not get a newsletter because you're not a member, there are some newsletters out on the round table in the common room too. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.